Hey everybody, welcome to the 139th episode of Primo NUTMEG. Today's show is going to be a very special one. My guest today is Gary Chartier, the Distinguished Professor of Law and Business Ethics and Associate Dean of the Tom and V. Zapara School of Business at La Sierra University, and a Senior Fellow at the Center for a Stateless Society. On the show today, we're going to map out the entire libertarian spectrum. We're going to talk about the Libertarian Party, Ayn Rand and the Objectivists, Murray Rothbard and the Anarcho-Capitalists, individual anarchists like Lysander Spooner, Benjamin Tucker, and Max Stirner. We're also going to talk about Henry George and Geo-libertarianism, as well as P.J. Proudhon and the Mutualists. We're also going to talk about the Libertarian Socialists and Syndicalists, with a specific focus on Noam Chomsky and George Orwell. We're also going to discuss the Anarcho-communists, namely Mikhail Bakunin, Peter Kropotkin, and Emma Goldman. So please stay tuned, and while you're listening to the show, please do help support Primo NUTMEG. It just takes a few clicks of the mouse. Please subscribe to the Primo NUTMEG YouTube channel, then stop by Facebook and like the Primo NUTMEG Facebook page. Then just hop over to Twitter and follow the Primo NUTMEG Twitter account. And from there, it'll only take a couple more seconds to follow Primo NUTMEG on Instagram. Now, for those of you who can spare $1 a month, from there you're going to want to go to patreon.com/Primo NUTMEG. And by becoming a patron for just $1 a month, you'll get access to hours and hours of forgotten content. This includes some of our most controversial shows, including my interview with former U.S. Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney. And beyond getting access to all of this content, you'll also be helping this show. You'll be helping to make more episodes like this one possible. So thank you everybody for liking, subscribing, sharing, commenting, and becoming a patron for just $1 a month. We really do appreciate all of the support. And now, without any further ado, let's get to this very special edition of Primo NUTMEG with Gary Chartier. Gary Chartier, welcome to Primo NUTMEG.
It's great to be here.
So thank you so much for being on. It really is an honor. And I want to start out by saying that I'm a little torn about doing a show like this because I personally am very fascinated by different schools of libertarian thought, certainly reading the great libertarian thinkers. However, I often get pretty frustrated about the factionalism of libertarianism and different groups fighting with each other over different semantics and whatnot. So before we get into all of this, I just wanted to get a little bit of background on you. How did you discover libertarianism, and where do you see yourself on the libertarian spectrum?
I suppose that I started out from the same place as a lot of Americans who might use the word libertarian for themselves, at least in my generation, which is to say I had Goldwaterite parents, and I read science fiction, I programmed computers, and I was socially awkward. And I started out really, I think, sort of pushing to a principled extreme position that perhaps I picked up from my parents, and they certainly would have identified themselves with the right. For reasons that we don't need to get into now, I took, a fairly long detour from college on into, broadly speaking, the social democratic left, and then came back to libertarian ideas thanks to the combined efforts of George W. Bush and Barack Obama, who helped to radicalize me. And at the same time, I discovered the left libertarian project associated with people like Roderick Long and Kevin Carson. So the bottom line, I think, is that I started out identifying probably with a position that was somewhere on the right within libertarianism, drifted to the left, and then found my way back to a libertarianism that was on the left, having learned a variety of lessons during my time on the Stateless left, and at the time rediscovering the real merits of the libertarianism that I had initially embraced.
So if I was pressed, I would say that libertarianism broadly is an opposition to the state, or at least calling for a lessening of the state. And with that in mind, I just thought maybe we could start off by defining what the state is. Do you have any thoughts on how one might define what is the state?
I think that, to me, libertarianism is opposition to aggressive violence, or more broadly, more positively, support for a social order rooted in peaceful, voluntary cooperation. So I think that one can be socially and culturally libertarian, and that takes us in another, and I think, interesting direction. But as a political philosophy, I think that libertarianism is opposed to all forms of aggressive violence, and it's opposed to the state precisely because the state is the institutionalization of aggressive violence. The state, I take to be, roughly speaking, in line with the sociologist Max Weber, I take the state to be an entity that claims a monopoly over the definition and enforcement of legal rights in a particular geographic area. And so it exercises that monopoly through the threatened and frequently the actual use of force.
Okay, so with that, let's start mapping out the libertarian spectrum. And I think that a good place to start would be what most people think of when they hear libertarian. And that would be the Libertarian Party, Ayn Rand, Milton Friedman, this sort of trend of minarchist free market capitalism. I was wondering if maybe you could just give your own thoughts on how this strand of libertarianism evolved, where it came from. I've heard a lot of people say that it's really in the tradition of classical liberalism. Would you say that that's the case, or would you say that it's something profoundly different?
No, I would definitely say that it's in the broad tradition of classical liberalism. I guess it's worth noting at this point that Noam Chomsky, who's obviously associated with what would initially seem to be a very different sort of strand within the broad, small L libertarian tradition, identifies anarchism as a part of the classical liberal tradition, or is descended from it. And of course, his anarchism is quite different from mine in some ways. So if Chomsky's right about that, the simplest thing is to say that all of these varieties of libertarianism are in the broad liberal tradition and thus probably descended in some important respects from classical liberalism. Classical liberalism, of course, we associate with people like Adam Smith, with people in the Scottish Enlightenment, David Hume, therefore, on the continent, certainly with people like Immanuel Kant. And we might think about classical liberalism in this sense as concerned with individual freedom, with commercial freedom, and with eliminating religious domination as a source of political conflict. And so thus we get, though the earlier classical liberals probably wouldn't have thought in these terms, the idea that the defining feature of the liberal tradition is to minimize the extent to which the law is used to impose any sort of vision of good on society. So certainly I think that somebody like Milton Friedman, somebody like Friedrich Hayek, these people are very much in that liberal tradition and very clearly and self-consciously descended from the 18th and 19th century classical liberals. Rand is a little more complicated. Rand, I think, while she obviously would in general have embraced features of classical liberal economics, seeks her philosophical inspiration, in some ways elsewhere in Aristotle. And while certainly the classical liberals are, like Aristotle, virtue theorists, their social theory tends to be more pragmatic, consequentialist. Rand, instead, it seems to me, embraces a much more rigorously, in the broad sense, deontological view, I think, with regard to political and indeed interpersonal ethics. So while she's certainly part of the broad liberal tradition, her really robust proposed limitations on state action make her more radical than people we would normally think of as classical liberals. And while she's not an anarchist, her views are very close in many respects to those of the anarchists. She's probably closer, even though she wants to embrace a kind of minimal state. She's really closer, I think, in her views to an anarchist like Murray Rothbard than she is to a small government libertarian like Friedman or Hayek.
That's actually pretty interesting that you would say that, because Rothbard famously, he associated with Rand, and actually Walter Block, I believe, had met her as well.
Yes.
But Rothbard famously wrote that the Rand Circle was a cult. So you really think that they're more in line with each other? I mean, because Rand, for example, she had also advocated for, a minarchist state, right? She said that the state has to have a monopoly on violence. So wouldn't that in itself kind of put her more in line with the Libertarian Party, for example?
The Libertarian Party, of course, embraces both anarchists and minarchists, and the famous Dallas Accord commits the party to not committing to any sort of positive state action. So the Libertarian Party seeks to be a big tent with regard to anarchists and minarchists. You're absolutely right, of course, that Rand is a minarchist, but she's got an ultra-minimal state. Her view is that, as far as I can see, that the state ought to be funded with user fees rather than with conventional taxes, and what she wants the state to do is very limited indeed. And so when I link her with Rothbard, I do so for several reasons. First of all, because her reasons for affirming constraints on state action are, broadly speaking, deontological natural law reasons of much the same kind Rothbard invokes. That's number one. Number two, the limits she proposes are so extreme that while she still wants to think there ought to be a monopoly state, she wants to acknowledge the appropriateness of considerably less state action than the libertarians, who are not only in the broad liberal tradition, but seem more obviously like direct descendants of the classical liberals. Again, I think people like Friedman and Hayek. And of course, thirdly, I associate her with Rothbard because I think Rothbard's own Aristotelianism developed, I think, in part in dialogue with and as a result of his learning from her. Obviously, he went on to read a lot of stuff on his own and develop his own natural law ideas. But it strikes me that at least, in the early stages, he appears to have benefited significantly from his intellectual association with her. So I certainly don't want to elide the differences. And as we know, official objectivism has tended to, in one way or another, view libertarians as awful people. But it still seems to me that in her radicalism, Rand turns out to be closer to Rothbard, maybe in some important respects, than she is to Hayek Fried.
What do you think it was that made Rothbard more radical in calling for anarchism or anarcho-capitalism? Was it the influence of the Austrian school of economics, or was he pulling from other sources?
So Rothbard was the first major Austrian to be an anarchist, to my knowledge. And so I think he was himself developing the Austrian school in a more radical direction. And in turn, Rand, of course, was influenced by the Austrian school. Mises was somebody with whom she at least occasionally socialized, and Henry Hazlitt, whom we certainly might think of as, at least influenced by the Austrians, was part of her world as well. So I don't think the Austrian school alone is sufficient to explain the difference. I think that Rothbard, and certainly other people would know the intellectual history much better than I do, but I think that Rothbard started out as, I think many libertarians do, with a deep-seated, visceral antipathy to violent power. And he used the tools of the Austrian school, but I think we've seen people do this with other branches of economic theory as well, to really show how it would be possible for social order to be sustained without any kind of monopolistic use of force. But I think where Rothbard differed from the minarchists was his courageous willingness to look the possibility of anarchy in the eye, not blink, and conclude that, in fact, it was realistic and a logical development of both, on the one hand, basic economic principles, and on the other hand, basic moral principles. Rothbard, it seems to me, was a rationalist in the best sense, not in the sense that, I think we might want to criticize, that is, the rationalist is somebody who has a blueprint for society that he or she tries to impose by force. but just a rationalist in the sense that Rothbard was somebody who took certain principles very seriously on both the economic and the moral sides of the divide and ran with them as far as they would go. And he saw, I think in both cases, that both the economic case, that is, and the moral case, that they led not to minarchism but to anarchism. You're probably aware of Roy Childs' famous open letter to Ayn Rand. Childs, at the time is a great enthusiast for Rand's own work, embraces her moral and political views, and then simply notes that, in fact, if one takes her own opposition to the use of force and her own rejection of, privilege and monopoly in other contexts seriously, her own views lead naturally to anarchism. And, that wasn't exactly, I think, the way it worked for Rothbard, but I think it was natural for him to acknowledge in the moral and economic spheres that if you took the relevant principles seriously, the state was simply, on the economic side, unnecessary and counterproductive, and on the moral side, unjust.
So I did want to start out by defining the state, because I've heard criticisms of anarcho-capitalism that it effectively would lead to a form of feudalism, or I guess effectively a lot of mini states where you have these powerful private entities who control these spaces and have a monopoly on the use of force within these geographic areas. Do you think that that is a fair criticism of Murray Rothbard and anarcho-capitalism? Or do you think that that criticism is flawed?
I think the worry that we might, in an anarchist society organized along, let's say along market lines, whatever we mean by capitalism, that we might, in one way or another, license a resurgence of feudalism, I think is understandable, right? So if you think about as radically libertarian a figure as the famous English social philosopher Herbert Spencer, who's actually not just a social philosopher, he really wrote a broad range of areas of philosophy. Herbert Spencer, who is often and rightly thought of as, one of the most radical libertarian figures in the 19th century, Spencer, in my view, wrongly, but I think very understandably, embraced a kind of, what we might call a Georgist view before George, that is a view in which land was to be owned by the state, precisely because he was afraid that if private land ownership was possible, then in the kind of free society he envisioned, a small number of people could acquire all the land and then, as he says, become lords of the earth. So it's not just a criticism lodged by social anarchists and others. Here's somebody very much within the libertarian tradition, somebody who doesn't like the state at all, nonetheless imagining, again, I think not very consistently or successfully, that somehow the state could save us from feudalism. So I think there are real worries about those kinds of possibilities. And I don't think that any sort of moral or economic theory can guarantee that there won't be tyranny. I think that, you can have people who act in abusive ways and who use the power that they have to make other people miserable. I don't think you can guarantee that won't happen. The best that I can say is that in the kind of market anarchist arrangements that I would support, the more pluralism you have in the first place, the more competition there is, the more opportunities there are for both voice and exit, then the less chance there is in the particular case of the kind of abuse you describe happening. I certainly don't think you can rule it out. I will say, by the way, that the scenario you describe is one of the motivators behind my view that the libertarian enthusiasm for things like HOAs and condominium arrangements as sort of ideal sets of social institutions for a free society, that vision is just bizarre. I think that the more you get the provision of services by institutions, like condominium arrangements, like HOAs, the more you're going to see that kind of petty tyranny that you described. I think anybody who's lived in an HOA is likely to be very much aware of the risks of local tyrants asserting themselves. People want to participate in those kinds of arrangements. That's obviously up to them. But my own view is that that's why it's really crucial, as much as possible, for those who populate a free society to support the creation of justice institutions, legal institutions, dispute resolution institutions that are deterritorialized. Even if, let's say, the local participants in, the neighborhood association own the streets together, you don't want those people also operating the courts as a group, because it seems to me you want, arbitration mechanisms and security mechanisms provided by services that are not territorially linked. So I don't have to, leave my home in order to fire my security provider, whether that security provider be a for-profit or a not-for-profit or a religious group or whatever. So anyway, all I'm saying is I think the worry is understandable. I don't think there's any way of banishing it completely. I would just say the better you design institutions to allow for ease of exit and for ongoing competition, the more you can minimize those risks.
So if we were to move left across the spectrum one step from anarcho-capitalism, I'm not quite sure which school would come immediately to the left of ANCAPs. Would you say that it would be Sam Konkin and the agorist school that he founded? Or would you say that it would be the individualist anarchist philosophy, this tradition of Benjamin Tucker and Lysander Spooner?
It's a little complicated to know where to place some of those folks. So I think that all of the groups you talk about probably should be seen as left of a certain kind of stereotypical ANCAP. I think real life ANCAPs probably don't always conform to the ideal types, and it's probably much more difficult in real life to determine who falls into what category. But I think that the Konkinites and the self-described voluntarists and the Tuckerite, Spoonerite individualist anarchists, should all be seen as to the left of the ideal type ANCAP in, I think, two respects. First, that there's a real preference for decentralized, small-scale, fluid economic institutions, for self-employment, work by contract, and so forth, and much more skepticism than I think you might find among, again, the kind of stereotypical ANCAPs about the large hierarchical corporation. Certainly, I don't think any of the folks in any of those three groups would say, there's something inherently impossible or evil about, larger and more hierarchical organizations. But the question is whether they're desirable and whether state action doesn't, in fact, tend to prop them up to a significant extent. And, the other thing, it seems to me, is that it's certainly not a necessary feature at all of being an ANCAP, but I do think that certain stereotypical ANCAPs might be more socially conservative than folks affiliated with the three groups that you just mentioned. Certainly if you think about Tucker and Spooner and the people around them, they saw themselves as not only opponents of, kind of state corporate alliances and thus as supporters of labor, but also as very much involved in a range of liberal social causes, notably feminism and free love, that probably would not necessarily engage the enthusiasm of some stereotypical ANCAPs. Again, I don't want to argue that the demarcations are obvious or necessary. I think, in fact, they're fairly fluid. But certainly it's the case, I think, that Konkin, who definitely favored the individual self-employed entrepreneur over the participant in the corporate behemoth, and the voluntarists and certainly the Tucker Spoonerites, do have a more self-conscious lefty identification. I think Konkin certainly wanted to talk at some points in leftist terms, and I think that was obviously where Tucker and his circle lived. So I think you're right when you think about moving to the left to know those folks.
And one name that I didn't mention either was Stirner. However, he had kind of an interesting history because he was tied in with the new Hegelians and the sort of Marxist crowd as well. So how would you really categorize Stirner?
I don't think that I know enough about Stirner's substantive views about economic freedom to know where he'd end up on the political compass. Clearly, you might think of Stirnerite egoism as, at any rate, compatible with full-blown both personal and economic freedom, at least to the extent that, as we know, later in his life, Tucker officially identified himself as a kind of Stirnerite. And so if he did that consistently, if that, actually turns out to be a reasonable way of thinking about things, I'm not confident that it is, but if that's the case, then you'd certainly think that the option would be available for a Stirnerite to embrace both economic and civil or personal freedom to an extreme. But I don't know enough about Stirner's own substantive views of economic freedom to really say much about where you want to locate him as an individual. But what's important to emphasize here, maybe, or at least what I can talk about with any kind of credibility, is not perhaps the precise lines of historical influence, but just the way in which I think for many people, even if not those in the process of articulating explicit political philosophies, an approach like Stirner's appeals because there's a passion for freedom and self-definition that comes first, and political philosophy explicitly working out moral or legal or political ideas comes second. And so while, you find people talking often in highly abstract terms about patterns of social organization and theoretical constraints on the use of force and so forth, willing to bet that more than one person inclined to write in those abstract ways really is somebody who first and foremost found libertarian ideas appealing because of the passion for individual self-creation of the kind that might come from the influence of somebody like Stirner.
Well, along those same lines, would you say that Nietzsche would be very similar?
Right, and I think that's absolutely right. And of course, Nietzsche's own views are worked out in complicated and often quite literarily sophisticated ways. And as we know, Nietzsche has been claimed as an inspiration for an immense variety of political movements. And we even know that, and I'm not going to remember the citation, there is actually one passage in Nietzsche in which he talks in a fashion like that of the early sort of proto-Marxist anarchist Gustavo Molinari about the market provision of justice services and so forth. So we certainly can find not only an immense individualism of the kind that obviously might inspire many anarchists, but even sometimes, substantive political views that might seem broadly anarchist. I certainly don't think that's straightforwardly obvious as a uniform feature of Nietzsche's position. Most anarchists tend to embrace a kind of moral egalitarianism and indeed a kind of moral passion that's obviously going to be alien to Nietzsche. And so I don't think that there's a straightforward, Nietzschean libertarianism waiting in the wings. But, on the other hand, the influence is really profoundly there on anarchists. And also, I think, this is more controversial probably, but I think on Rand.
I think she actually did bring him up in her writings, but said that, he was irrational. But just getting back to moving left across the spectrum, I would say that, I don't know if you might disagree with me, I'd place Henry George and the Georgist tradition, and certainly the more recent Fred Foldvery geo-libertarian school, And I think to some degree, in that same bucket, you might be able to put the Green Party or some aspects of the Green Party. I know I've personally seen Howie Hawkins call for a land value tax. But would you say that that's all, again, within the not only classical liberal tradition, but also within the libertarian tradition?
So certainly I think that's true of somebody like Folvari. As I observed earlier, Herbert Spencer, who's really a canonical libertarian figure, took what was, in many ways a kind of Georgist position about state ownership of land. So I have no objection at all to seeing the kind of position that, that many Georgists would take as leaving them within the broad, libertarian and liberal traditions. George, of course, was a big free trade enthusiast, so definitely saw himself as someone who was not interested in bolstering the power of the state. He had some, I think some views that were not particularly libertarian. He wanted, for instance, like state ownership of the railroads. But I think his own views were basically pro-freedom, pro-market views. And so, yeah, I think the Georgists and folks who live in nearby spaces, are quite rightly regarded as in the libertarian camp.
I think that, a lot of, especially ANCAPs, would say it doesn't make any sense, this geo-libertarianism, because you're calling for not only a tax, but you need somebody to collect the tax. So again, I think this gets back to our question of what is a state. So if you had, small communities that expect you to pay a tax on the land because, again, the philosophy of Georgism is that man did not create nature, and it goes back to the Lockean proviso. And because of that, you owe the community a tax. Do you think that could be considered a state?
Well, I think if it's collected by force, it is inconsistent with what I take to be, the kind of libertarianism I'd prefer to endorse. But I'm not interested in drawing lines that would exclude those people from the libertarian tradition. Okay, I disagree with them. I think about that point, as I would disagree with a number of people along this spectrum that we're describing in a variety of ways. But so what? I think they're still libertarian. All of the groups we've talked about, and all of the ones we're going to talk about, want to enable people to avoid tyranny. We want to help people to escape tyranny. And I think, in part, there's a kind of pragmatic question about which kinds of institutions are most likely to secure people against tyranny, right? So the folks who affirm markets and private property as central tend to think that securing robustly circumscribed rights to control particular, bits of physical reality is what's needed to secure people against tyranny. If there's a clearly demarcated space that's mine, then others can't simply ride roughshod over me. On the other hand, I think the folks on the social anarchist side, and also the folks like the Georgists, as I noted, this was a concern of Spencer, I think are worried about the kind of tyranny that can happen, they fear, when individuals use those private property rights to acquire substantial influence over the lives of others. And so, again, I think there's partly a sort of pragmatic difference about which institutions best safeguard people against incursions into their discretionary space. And I think there's also probably just some normative disagreement about which interests are most worth protecting. And that, I suspect, may in part be a difference that has to do with the degree to which an approach is individualistic. But I suspect there are some other normative disagreements as well.
So again, moving left across the spectrum, I know that the Mutualists and P.J. Proudhon, they kind of get tied in with the Georgists to some degree. I've even had Kevin Carson on the show, and I believe that he kind of identified identified Proudhon as a proto-Georgist insofar as they kind of agreed on the land question. But mutualists also have this distinction that they think that capital and currency should be publicly owned and that there should be these mutual credit banks. And I think maybe this also, you could draw a line from that to the public banking movement that's out there. So again, just kind of, if we could maybe go into this a little bit, how would you describe this motivation to have these public banks or these mutual credit banks within mutualism?
So I don't think my ability to say anything smart about banking of any kind is very substantial. So I don't have a great deal to say about that. The term mutualism, of course, gets used in a wide variety of ways to talk about a number of different positions along the anarchist spectrum. For instance, I think in the United States, in my experience, the term mutualism has often been used primarily to single out, a kind of strand of individualist anarchism that embraces the view held by Tucker as well as by Joshua Ingalls regarding land tenure. That of course being that my ownership of land depends on my personal occupancy and use of the land, that I can't own land by proxy, and that if I'm personally absent for too long from the land, then it becomes ripe for homesteading again. This, of course, has been motivated, I think, primarily by the kinds of worries we already talked about related to a fear of reestablishing feudalism. And so, the thought obviously has been that if land can only be owned when personally occupied, then it's not going to be possible for somebody to create vast estates run by absentee landlords who then can exercise the kind of tyranny that the Spencer and others worried about.
So again, moving leftwards from mutualism, and again, I'm going to need your help here a little bit. I would say that leftwards from there, you'd find the syndicalist tradition, again, sort of in the vein of the IWW, and going back to the Spanish Civil War and the populist front there. Would you say that that's accurate, or would you say that there's something in between those two schools of thought?
No, I think that seems right to me, that views which emphasize decentralized worker ownership of the means of production, as the syndicalists would, with perhaps nested councils that might involve them in more sort of comprehensive decision making, obviously can run the risk of taking us back toward some kind of state, but I think probably need not. Yeah, so that seems to me to be a view that is distinct. It's the kind of anarchism with which Chomsky's tended to identify, and it's obviously distinct from the mutualists who clearly have in general views that allow for a fair amount of what we think about as private ownership of the means of production. But for the syndicalists, it is the workers who indeed own particular productive assets, and so that's obviously going to be quite different from views that we'll find farther along the spectrum that want to affirm broader collective ownership in some way. So yeah, I think your characterization seems right to me.
I think it's worth noting, too, that George Orwell really wrote fondly about the anarchists when he wrote Homage to Catalonia, about yes. the anarchist communities that they had there, the syndicalist communities.
Yeah, it seems to me, Orwell is often described as a libertarian socialist, and that expression can be used in all kinds of different ways, as we know. So certainly, I think that Orwell's appreciation, for the Spanish anarchists, certainly says a good deal about his own anti-authoritarianism. Obviously, his most famous novels also speak pretty clearly to his identification with, a robustly anti-authoritarian political regime, and obviously Animal Farm and 1984 have been classics of, deep skepticism about state power. So, I think Orwell's somebody who's, he's obviously not, a doctrinaire proponent of any of the I think libertarian views that we've talked about here, but is seems to me he clearly is somebody who's identified broadly with the tradition.
And you did bring up Chomsky. I really did want to talk about him too, because he's actually another previous guest on the show on the 24th.
Oh, awesome.
Yep, Primo Nutmeg number 24. We had him on, and actually, it was a very controversial type show too, insofar as I had asked him about the Federal Reserve, and this is something that we kind of skipped over and didn't really talk about. The whole Ron Paul movement and the Fed and whatnot. But this is really a main tenet of right-wing libertarianism or anarcho-capitalism or voluntarism, is that you wouldn't have a central bank. And when I interviewed Noam Chomsky, he actually supported it. He said that, because the state is somewhat responsive to the will of the people, you would want to have something like the central bank, or that getting rid of it isn't a top priority, and you'd want to more focus on worker-owned co-ops and things like that. But it seems like if you really study Chomsky, even though he identifies himself as an anarchist, he seems to be very apologetic for state power, and this is true of brutal communist dictatorships. He's even been somewhat apologetic to what's happened in China or Venezuela or the Khmer Rouge even. Do you think that this is maybe a flaw in libertarian socialism, in that in trying to justify socialism, or in trying to justify libertarian socialism, you can also justify state socialism, and that you end up not having really a focus on dismantling these hierarchical institutions?
Yeah, so I think there are real risks there, and just as it seems to me, when you want to defend market-oriented varieties of libertarianism, it becomes very easy, if you're not careful, to defend actually existing economic conditions, even though those might well be really quite deficient from a variety of libertarian standpoints. I think unavoidably, people's libertarian commitments are linked with other political and social commitments. And I don't think there's somehow a way around that. And I think that unavoidably there are temptations that come along with that. So Chomsky's anarchism is aspirational, it often seems, and serves as a kind of, it's linked with his own, really kind of, often, fairly social democratic politics. It's just that he justifies his political claims in more radical terms, but it's not that the agenda he's pushing, is in the immediate term anarchist. I mean, I think, the notion that the Federal Reserve, which is, pretty obviously, not that I think this would be a good thing, but it's not some sort of technocratic independent entity working for the public good. It's pretty clearly very much to the benefit of large financial institutions in the military-industrial complex. And there's something ironic about someone who's a critic of both large financial institutions and the military-industrial complex offering even a tepid defense of the Fed. As you might know, Roderick Long, whom if you haven't hosted, you should. He's a wonderful guest.
I've written him. I want to get him on.
Roderick wrote a piece that you probably ran across some years ago called "Chomsky's Augustinian Anarchism," reflecting on the fact that famously in the Confessions, Saint Augustine talks about having prayed to God, "Give me chastity, but not yet." And there's, I think the sense that Chomsky and anarchists like him often seem to be praying, "Give me anarchy, but not yet." And I think that Chomsky has highlighted issues that have been part of a radical critique. He clearly has, in some ways, probably made anarchism somewhat more respectable socially. But he certainly is not in the agenda that he himself has defended, trying to move us particularly closer to anarchism. So I think you're closer to anarchy. So yeah, I think your concerns seem to me to be quite on point.
Right, and not to dwell on it too much, but additionally, during my interview with him, he was even justifying in swing states voting for Hillary Clinton, who is probably the least anarchist person you can think of. And then also previously, I've seen him, criticize Ron Paul and saying that Ron Paul's ideals are savagery. So it's really funny to me because it seems like And I recognize this happens on the right too, where people just automatically demonize anything that criticizes "quote unquote" capitalism, or you see that meme of "this is your grocery store in capitalism, this is your grocery store in socialism." That's not true. It's this is your grocery store on corporatism and imperialism. But I guess this is what really frustrates me the most when examining these different traditions, is that people seem to get so wrapped up in this right-left battle, this capitalism versus communism or socialism battle, that they're able to justify, for example, voting for Hillary Clinton. I mean, does that frustrate you as well?
I do find the willingness to offer anarchist endorsement of thuggish politicians to be deeply troubling. So if I may be pardoned for saying so, the degree to which a number of libertarians and anarchists, it seems to me, spent the first 2 years almost of the Trump administration convinced that Trump was somehow a stealth libertarian, continues to just make me roll my eyes. And I mean, I think we got a year and a half of editorials from Justin Raimondo at antiwar.com reassuring us repeatedly that, Trump was the anti-imperialist, anti-interventionist candidate. Now, if you follow Justin's, characteristically incisive and pointed remarks, you'll note that within the last day or so, he's written something just absolutely blasting Trump, and I cheer him for that. But I think, it does become really tempting to do this. And it's like you might remember now, a quarter century ago when Rothbard and some of the people around him were convinced that the populist candidacy of Pat Buchanan was something they ought to be enthusiastic about. Again, I mean, Buchanan, who is a smart, funny guy who is known to some people I know, was, in some limited sense, an anti-interventionist in foreign policy, but he wasn't, as far as I can see, a person whose agenda should have made libertarians happy. Obviously he was and continues to be a protectionist and so forth. So one thing we might say with regard to anarchists of all sorts is that there's a surprising temptation to regard the state political process as a means of salvation. I think it's bizarre for people who are doubtful at such a deep level about state power. I just don't think it's very sensible. But it's as if when the rubber meets the road, these anarchists, whether they're Chomsky cheering for Clinton or Block cheering for Trump, it's as if, even though they're both aware, obviously, of the problems with those candidates, I'm quite sure if you got Chomsky and Block in a room, they could tell you lots of things that were wrong with Trump and Clinton. They nonetheless seem to think somehow that supporting these candidates in some active way is still, the anarchist thing to do. And it's as if they really do continue to sort of put their hope in a political process that they, seems to me, ought to recognize is deeply, deeply flawed. It doesn't mean, obviously, that you might not think strategically there would be some candidates who, even if not perfect, you might want to endorse. Somebody might want to endorse a Ron Paul or a Dennis Kucinich, but endorsing Trump or Clinton just strikes me as making a joke of one's anarchist credentials.
Right. Gary, I know that we're running over. I did just want to briefly, just so we don't leave anybody out, I did just also want to mention the anarcho-communist tradition.
Yeah, sure.
That of Emma Goldman, Mikhail Bakunin, Peter Kropotkin. I don't know if maybe you just want to maybe speak broadly about what this tradition holds dear, what they represent.
As somebody, who's kind of broadly in the Tucker Spooner tradition, I am, doubtful about the economic views of these folks. On the other hand, I think they get all kinds of credit for their genuine anti-authoritarianism. So we know, for instance, that Bakunin famously projected in the 1870s that were Marx's ideas to be implemented, they would lead to radical tyranny. And, it's not as if this was just a claim being made by, bourgeois politicians and economists in England or something. This was an idea being proffered by somebody else who was a self-described communist in, of course, the country where Marx's ideas really were embraced most enthusiastically by the political class ultimately. So, I give Bakunin huge credit there. Similarly, I think Emma Goldman, really was somebody who had the courage of her convictions to, go to Russia after the revolution, to, arrive as an optimist and leave very much aware of the tyranny that was brewing. And, even though she had, as we know, a very complicated relationship with American institutions, and certainly wouldn't have offered, nor would we want or expect her to have offered any sort of unqualified endorsement of those institutions, nonetheless could say, I think, surprisingly affirming things about the embrace of freedom in American social and political culture at its best. So I think. And the other thing I would say that I'd really want to celebrate there is Kropotkin's recognition of the way in which evolutionary biology could tell us something about social institutions and their ability to emerge from the bottom up and to maintain order in the absence of top-down authority. And I think this is something that is very much to the credit of people in that tradition. Obviously not unique to them, but I think Kropotkin, my guess is, would have been one of the first to make that point about spontaneous order of course, an anarcho-communist kind, but with specific reference to biology. The bottom line, and I think your comments about this earlier are ones that I really want to endorse. Obviously, we've all got particular concerns, particular social visions that distinguish us. But at the same time, I really do want to cheer for the idea that those who are opposed to war, those who are opposed to state violence, those who favor genuinely inclusive communities, whatever their precise views about law or economics, nonetheless ought to recognize each other as engaged in a really important common enterprise.
I think that in a truly free society, in a truly free world, you wouldn't have just one dogma. You wouldn't have the entire world living under anarcho-capitalism or anarcho-communism or anything in between. You'd have sort of a multiverse of different kinds of schools of thought flourishing, because there would be no state sort of dominating people and telling them the way that they're supposed to live.
Absolutely. I mean, I think people would unavoidably continue to engage in a wide variety of social experiments. And I think it would be even easier to do this because of communication technology and all that makes possible, with the result that various kinds of communities wouldn't need to occupy contiguous territories. And, you could have a great deal of experimentation, both geographically based and not geographically based. There's a certain irony, perhaps from some perspectives here, but it seems like we're talking about something that's very much like what Bob Nozick talks about at the end of Anarchy, State, and Utopia as a utopia of utopias, right? With, a whole range of social experiments available for people to participate in. So, yeah, I think that's an ideal. And as long as people are nonviolent and there are easy exit opportunities, let 1,000 flowers bloom, and social experimentation will help us all figure out more clearly the kinds of institutions we'd like to live under.
Gary Chartier, thank you very much for being on this episode of Primo NUTMEG. It really was an honor to go through all of these different philosophies with you. For folks who are interested in your analysis, where can they learn more about you and your work?
I've got a variety of books which can be found at Amazon and elsewhere. I've got a website, though unfortunately needs to be updated, that provides some information at GaryChartier.net or GaryChartier.com, and a number of op-ed level pieces that I can be found at the Center for Stateless Society, C4SS.org, which of course also includes pieces from some of the other people we've discussed, including that Chomsky's Augustinian Anarchism piece that I mentioned earlier. So hunt up books on Amazon, check out my website. causes at c4ss.org. And also, I guess, you can find me holding forth in a variety of videos on YouTube.
Gary Chartier, thank you again for being on this episode of Primo NUTMEG, and hopefully we can have you back at some point in the future.
That would be a blast.